From the southeastern corner of western North Carolina, this is Folklore. I'm your host, James Hernishin. Until now, this podcast has been my modest attempt to apply what's happening in the world around us to the local scene. How we respond to forces from beyond the 238 square miles that define the somewhat arbitrary political jurisdiction we call home. But the flow of information and influence goes in the other direction too. And for a couple of years now, I've been hoping to interview a certain young woman who grew up in these hills, but who was headed for the wider world. To ask her about how her upbringing and her early days as a student at Saluda Elementary has shaped her worldview and how she would be applying what she absorbed as a child of Polk County to wherever she was headed. I didn't have any idea where she'd end up, but it almost certainly wouldn't be back in the southeastern corner of western North Carolina, at least not for the next few decades. Cecelia Thompson is now a senior at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where she's studying political science, specifically the politics of peace and justice. And until a few weeks ago, she was on track to serve in the diplomatic corps as an employee of the U.S. State Department. But then the 47th president froze all hiring across the civil service. And then he fired some 20,000 employees, at last count, mostly probationary hires and those just starting out in their careers. And then he began gutting the U.S. Agency for International Aid. And then he and his vice president decided to upend our entire foreign policy playbook, abandoning the last 80 years of diplomacy in favor of dictator-friendly deal-making. Here's how Eric Edelman, a former U.S. ambassador to Finland and Turkey, describes how State Department staff now have to think about their jobs.
The beginning of wisdom on this is that when you said, how do you survive this? I think you need to start by saying you may not. You may not survive this. You may get fired. That's a reality. You need to be prepared to resign.
That's a former ambassador who served under both Democratic and Republican presidents, speaking on an episode of the Shield of the Republic podcast, which is part of a conservative media organization called The Bulwark. So not exactly a Bernie bro, in case you were wondering. Then, a few days ago, this happened in the Oval Office of the White House.
But you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless.
You
God bless. You will not have a war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because
I'm
you're in no position to dictate that.
That's exactly what you're doing.
You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very good.
You will feel influence.
We're going to feel very good and very strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. Right now, you don't. You're playing cards.
So, Cecelia is no longer looking for a job at the State Department after she graduates this spring. That wasn't the context in which I hoped to have her on my podcast. After I called her last week just to get her thoughts, I was even skeptical that it was in her best interest to record an episode. But she wasn't shy about speaking out. Quite the contrary. So this past Monday, the day our current president cut off military support to Ukraine, and the day before he imposed tariffs on Canada and Mexico and China for no good economic reason, we talked about how she's handling the new reality and how she fits into it. She joined me on a FaceTime call from Chapel Hill. Cecelia Thompson, welcome to Folklore.
Hey, James. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I wanted to talk to you because you are kind of like an example of what current federal politics is doing to the future. So tell me about where you are in your educational and career path at UNC.
So I am currently finishing out my degree at UNC Chapel Hill, studying political science and peace and justice studies. I've been fortunate to have some working experience in D.C. before everything got crazy the past couple of months. It's always crazy in D.C., but it's been especially crazy the past couple of months. I spent the junior spring semester I spent my junior spring working at the State Department in the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. So that's anti-trafficking work. And now I am working virtually with State's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. So there I'm in the refugee admissions program, but of course that program has just been cut. So we've been focused recently on a lot of exit interviews and just wrapping everything up so we have a good jumping off point when the program hopefully starts back up in 4 years.
And it's not just you then. We're talking about a whole cadre of people.
Yeah, there are a lot of us who are in a situation similar to what I'm in because there's now a federal hiring freeze that is affecting most new hires in the federal government, except some areas of immigration and national security. So, in most of my classes, I have at least 2 or 3 friends who have either been rejected a job offer or have been offered a job, but then got an email saying that the offer had been rescinded. So it's definitely a big point of contention we're having right now.
Okay, well, let's talk about you and the reason for why you're where you are. What interested you in serving in the State Department world, in the diplomatic corps?
Yeah, I've always been interested in politics and current events, but I think I would agree, or I think most of the political science students in my classes would agree that Trump's election in 2016 was really the moment where we gained consciousness in politics. I was only 14 at the time in 8th grade, but in this way, my understanding of politics has always been shaped by Donald Trump. He's been a politician for 10 years now. I've been taught by my instructors that Trump is an exception in politics, but for me, he's my normal. So I think I have this different lens of politics than a lot of previous generations have. But regarding diplomacy, I took a class my freshman year of college called The Ethics of Peace, War, and Defense. So in this class, we used Michael Walzer's book, Just and Unjust Wars, and we analyzed these ethical issues that arise in conflict. So we talked about terrorism, just war theory, weapons of mass destruction, all sorts of really complex topics. And they forced me to think about how nation states interact with each other in a way that I had never considered really at all. We had to write a couple of really crazy essays. One where we had to provide a case in which an act of limited terrorism against a state could be justified. And there was another prompt where it just said, fix the Israel-Palestine conflict in 5 pages. Go. Give me the best you got. And so these really radical ideas that I didn't even want to write at first because I'm looking at the prompt and I'm a teenager. What do I know about these huge issues that have had PhDs scratching their heads for almost a century? But I really had to sit down and analyze conflicts that I didn't know very much about from the perspectives of the civilians and the leaders involved. And I had to think about their point of view as opposed to what I would do if I were in their situation, if that makes sense. And this is where I became pretty enamored with diplomacy. I think it has this sort of unique power where you can engage directly with people when you're shaping policy. DC is a really cool place, not just because it has like-minded people, but because very few young professionals are from the DC area. So living there, I would get to hear thoughts from people from all 50 states and a couple of internationals as well. But I still felt really distant from the people we were making policy for. You know, you hear about what people in other countries need and what their perspectives are on different social issues based on their history and their religion. But I was really missing this opportunity to engage directly with the people. And so this is kind of how I fell into the USAID State Department world. And the idea of being able to connect with people and address the community's needs in real time.
So you've been basically preparing for a career in that world for the last couple of years.
Yeah, for sure. One of my favorite professors of all time, Andy Sisson, he spent his career working for USAID. He worked in stabilizing Kosovo in the 90s. He led initiatives in Pakistan to mitigate conflict. And he was working at USAID for 30 plus years before he ended up actually writing so many cables of dissent that weren't really being addressed that he had to resign under Trump's first presidency.
I just want to make clear that this is the United States Agency for International Development, the one that basically has been completely destroyed in the last couple of weeks.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that it's also devastating because I don't know, you enter college and you hear about opportunities where career professionals are traveling all over the world to be able to engage on the ground with people and communities, and now the funding being completely slashed is just seems so far from reality.
That kind of brings me to my next question. I wanted to go back a few minutes there where you were talking about trying to distance yourself from your own personal point of view and the needs of the people you might be serving. So if you go back in history, are there times when you think you would have found yourself in a really difficult spot where you might have to end up resigning or something because you couldn't follow the orders that were coming through the food chain?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's this tension between policy and principle, right? And I'm sure there are many diplomats throughout history who've sort of grappled with whether they could effectively represent the country in good conscience. And I think the Vietnam War is a time where I feel as though I could not represent the US government. And that's not because I don't believe in the importance of diplomacy in uncertain times, because I absolutely do. But I just think that the core of the conflict and the policies that sustained it just clash really profoundly with my values. The Vietnam War devastated civilians. The U.S. military used herbicides, and misleading narratives were fed to the public. And I think it would be difficult for me to justify my presence in the U.S. government at a time like that. But also at the same time, this is a really complex choice. It's not all black and white. Some diplomats stayed on to advocate for more humane policies or maybe assist affected people. And I think that's really admirable. But for me, I think my energy would have been better directed outside the system and, to be able to challenge the worst narrative. I think being an ethical diplomat is knowing when your presence can help or legitimize harm. And yeah, so in Vietnam, I think the policy changes were too resistance or internal dissent for me to have been able to serve effectively.
Okay, so I ask you this because you've kind of had your career path derailed or at least delayed because, well, the State Department just isn't hiring anybody new, right? But if it was, given what you've seen happen with the U.S. aid agency, would can you still see yourself voluntarily becoming part of that machine?
Right now or
Yeah,
in the future?
yeah, right now.
Right now, I don't think so. I don't think that representing the US means endorsing every policy, but it is about, trying to push for better outcomes. And I think diplomats can advocate for climate policy action or refugee rights or gender equality, even when the administration doesn't prioritize these issues. But I think that it's okay to admit that there might be moments when stepping back is the right choice, especially when it's compromising core human rights and important values.
So in a way, there is, two things happening that either one really would have made it impossible for you to stick to what you hoped you were going to be doing, right? The freeze on hiring and the change in U.S. policy.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to zoom out and think about how I can position myself to help people the most effectively. And I think sometimes I also have trouble relaying that to people. Last spring, I was going into work in D.C. Many days there would be crowds of people protesting outside the building, mostly for Gaza, but for an assortment of humanitarian issues. And, they'd be yelling at me as I was going into work, and they threw red paint on my coworker. And it was frustrating because I'm going into work at the anti-trafficking office. I assure you, I'm not against you. But there is a fine line between internally dissenting and working for an administration that just conflicts with your values. So, yeah, there are several reasons why I feel at odds with working under the current administration, but I think there's a happy medium, and I don't think I need to agree with every policy an administration has for me to work there.
It's just that the last few days, have been extraordinarily dramatic when it comes to U.S. foreign policy shift, right? This morning, the Washington Post headline is that Washington now largely aligns with Moscow's vision, says the Kremlin. It's not really a headline I ever expected to read. Do you talk about this with your classmates?
Yeah, I think that is really, it's wild. I think this direction of isolationism and protectionism that the country is moving in doesn't seem to make any sense to me, because I think our allies through, trade, diplomacy, whatever, make us really strong. And when it's our turn to return the favor and help them out, I think we should stay true to our word. So this realignment with Russia, which has been pretty, generally one of our enemies for the past 80 years, I'm not sure I understand it at all. And maybe that's something, that I will understand after working in the foreign policy industry in that field for longer. But it's something I'm not understanding very well right now.
Well, I don't think a lot of people are understanding it. So if you're saying that it looks like you will not be pursuing the career you wanted for at least the next 4 years, what are you going to be doing?
So it's been really crazy to deal with the whiplash of whether a job would be available for me in the federal government. I knew when I left last spring, I thought there would be one, and then the back and forth with the election, I wasn't sure. And then I thought it would be in December, January, and then the hiring freeze hit. So it's not going to work out with the State Department right now, but I actually will be joining the Peace Corps in Guatemala at the end of August. So I'm going to be a youth development facilitator. And I think there's a silver lining in all of this, really. I think it's pretty invaluable that I'll get to spend time actually on the ground connecting with small communities, because sustainable development is really my greatest interest in foreign policy. And I think that all diplomats should understand how policy affects local people. I'm excited to work on my Spanish fluency because I've been intermediate for a really long time. It'll just be an opportunity for me to gain a completely new perspective. And diplomacy is a long game, right? So even if the path back to the State Department isn't immediate, and even in 4 years, maybe I'll still want to pursue opportunities with NGOs or think tanks, or I don't know, maybe even serve again in the Peace Corps. But I think this will make me a more thoughtful representative of the U.S. government when I eventually work my way back.
Well, it sounds like you're putting a real good positive spin on this, rather.
I'm trying. It's frustrating. I mean, it seems as though anything can happen right now. So I'm trying. I'm going against my instincts and trying not to plan everything out. But I really want to just keep an eye on all of this, because I want where I put my energy to be effective, and I don't want to be discouraged by a lack of policy action right now, because who knows, 6 months, everything could be different. So I'm trying to take it day by day.
Again, I think a lot of people are probably having no choice but to take it day by day. I assume you watched what happened in the White House on this past Friday.
Yes, with President Zelensky.
Yeah. I know you're not a professional State Department employee, at least not yet. You're just a senior at a university. But what did that mean to you to see such an unexpected display of it was contempt, really, in the Oval Office? Because you're a student of history, I assume.
Yes, honestly, it made me a little bit emotional just looking at a country that has relied on us for help and support. And I think, honestly, the most American thing we can do is to support a state in its efforts for sovereignty. And to see us turn our back on Ukraine and support Russia, it was really frustrating for me to see. And I don't expect everyone in the whole US to care about foreign policy. That's not how politics work. But I I'm a little upset at not seeing more people, even people who voted for President Trump, be questioning why we're seeing such uh unprofessional displays of diplomacy. It doesn't make me feel all that optimistic, and I know that Trump is a different kind of politician, and we don't see politicians like him as often. But I'm still um, hoping we can get away from that sort of isolationist, bullying style of politics that we're seeing.
Well, I think again you're not alone on that. I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts on this because I think the last couple of months must have been a real difficult time for people in your entire program.
Yeah, it's been crazy. I think a lot of people are not knowing what direction to turn at all. I think a lot of private sector jobs in DC with NGOs, think tanks, that sort of thing, are getting probably really saturated with applicants. And so I'm sure that has been super frustrating for people involved as well. It makes me more excited to get to go to the Peace Corps and get to avoid job cycles right now and applying for all sorts of jobs. But yeah, I know we're all kind of in it together. So that's one thing that gives me hope, knowing that it's not just me struggling to find my place in the diplomatic and foreign policy world right now. But yeah, it's crazy. It's definitely not what I was anticipating a year ago.
Well, you've got a couple more months of the student life, and then I assume you'll pay a visit back to Polk County briefly before you take off to Guatemala.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to spending 6 weeks or so back in Salua before I go for 2 years to Guatemala.
All right. Well, we'll look forward to seeing you then. Thanks again so much for talking.
Thanks so much for having me on. This was fun.
I did not expect to end that interview on a positive note, but it sounds like Cecelia has managed to come up with a pretty darn good plan B. Not everybody who's being forced to reconsider their career path can make a similar claim. She's showing resilience and grit at a difficult time. Maybe growing up here made at least a small contribution to those traits. If I'm still podcasting a decade from now, if podcaster is still a thing, I think I'll try to check up on how she's doing. Meanwhile, you can contact me with feedback and ideas for episodes by emailing jamesh@folklore.com. Thanks for listening.